Thank you for that, and thank you for the setup, Rosie and Ferris. It was just terrific. I love that they said understanding behavior is the key to changing behavior, because we're going to talk a little bit about that today. We all have a desire to influence the behavior of others. We all have designs on other people, and they have designs upon us. And in fact, science now believes that the brain evolved to want to change other people and to be changed by others. So maybe it is not news and entertainment that we are searching for, but rather it's change. So it's all imperative that we really try and study and do our best at human sciences, as we've talked about today. And as Mark Twain said, famously, it's not what you know that will hurt you. It's what you know that ain't so that will get you in trouble. So today I invite you to join me in rethinking what you thought you knew about how the human brain works. How well do you know its wiring and its impact on how to influence people? How well do you know how the brain reads and processes content and advertising? How well do you know what will drive a transaction, and not just any old transaction, but a transaction that's literally gold, because it's a transaction with a higher margin? This is what we're going to talk about. But to test how much you really know is what we're going to do first. So here's your first question. It may seem a little bit odd, but bear with me. True or false? We are marketing to people. True? Show of hands. True? Actually, we're marketing to gods. Now, Rashad Tabakawala, a name I know most of you know, actually first realized this, so this is his conclusion, but it's quite true. These are very demanding and powerful beings. They are unafraid today to let their opinions be known. They make no bones about trying to bring down business moguls or politicians or laws or brands that they disagree with. And of course, these are omni-channel gods. With their electronics, they can broadcast on any number of channels and any number of means. And of course, their content, which they put out and broadcast 5, 10, 15, 20 times a day, is deemed more relevant and interesting by their friends and family than the content put out by the 5 million brands in the United States. So these are very, very difficult entities to market to. And of course, they demand respect, as all gods do. They want immediate attention from you. They want personalized attention. And they want what they want on demand, whether it's customer service, whether it's entertainment, whether it's news. And they want it instantly. And of course, one can't push gods around. All you can really hope to do is pull them towards you by enchanting them, by doing something that will make them smile upon you and favor you. So we are really all marketing to gods, and that really changes the dynamics of how one influences them. Now, I'm not saying that these gods are, in every case, brilliant, which brings us to question number 2 of the test. True or false? Gods think that red pills are more potent than blue pills. True? It actually is true. In studies done with behavioral economical techniques, research shows that all of us, because we too are gods, believe that red pills, orange pills, and yellow pills are more effective than blue pills. Gods can be quite irrational. Question number 3. People known to have received coverage on TV are smarter, wealthier, better looking. True or false? True? Well, a few decades ago, this was true. This goes back to my graduate school research, where I gathered 4 groups of people. Each group had several hundred people in it because I wanted to test something sufficiently to see if it was statistically significant. All groups of people, however, received the same paragraph. It was a descriptor of a person who had appeared in the news. Now, for one of the 4 groups, the person appeared on TV. That was the one variable. In another group, the person appeared in radio, in another newspaper, and the last was a control group where no medium was listed. And the findings actually were statistically significant, that when somebody believed that someone had appeared on TV, they were assumed to be smarter, wealthier, better looking. In fact, under 9 characteristics far superior to anyone appearing in radio or newspaper in the control group. It's a curious thing, but this is definitely how the mind works. We jump to all kinds of conclusions based on one characteristic. And that characteristic may have absolutely nothing to do with the other conclusions we draw. It's just how the human mind works, jumping to conclusions with little or no evidence. So last question. Technology has altered the way people think. True? Actually, no. This has been the source of some study the last 10 years, as you might expect, and not too long ago, 109 ologist types met to go over all the data and analysis, and one of their conclusions was technology might provide us with unprecedented access to information, but not with what the brain chooses to do with it. In particular, one of the scientists at MIT said, electronic media aren't going to revamp the brain's mechanisms for information processing. Claims to the contrary are propelled by the pressure on pundits to announce that technology changes everything. So the truth of the matter is, when we have designs on influencing other people, we have to start with the evolutionary brain. Because while software today, technology software, might change every week or two, the truth of the matter is the technology of the brain goes back 100,000 years. To the limbic brain, because remember, the way we all operate today started without the huge prefrontal cortex that developed over the years. All thought started in the limbic brain, and so we really have to start with how our ancestors process information, which means the brain does not think as we think it thinks. For years, economic textbooks taught us rational thought. You have to do the price and the features and the functionality. The truth of the matter is, research has now shown that preference first develops for something in the subconscious, and when the need for a decision is triggered, preference moves to the conscious mind, and when asked, why did you make that decision, we rationalize it or excuse it with whatever information is top of mind or handy. But it's very likely that that information that is handy has nothing to do with what really drove the decision, because that is layered under the subconscious. And one reason this all happens is because so much of our learning is subconscious, implicit, an estimated 95%. There are some of the most fascinating tests out there where people will do magazine spreads, and there will be an ad for like Aquafina over here in the corner, but someone's reading an article and not even realize consciously that they saw the Aquafina ad, but later on they will show a slight preference for Aquafina. We take in so much implicitly we don't realize it. So when sometimes a decision seems impulsive, it's really because it's not. It's just that so much is layered under our subconscious, we don't realize it. This is why sometimes decision-making can seem so irrational. And it also means that the rational reasons people give us when we interview them in focus groups or dyads or triads, or when we do surveys, which give them, give people a chance to use their frontal cortex to give you a rational reason for why they feel the way they do. These things we cannot put much stock in, because it is not truly how the brain operates when making decisions. Decision-making is irrational, but predictably so. Perhaps you have studied behavioral economics, and you know that essentially the idea of saving $200 or preventing oneself from losing $200 are essentially the same thing. But research shows we are much more motivated to not lose $200 than to save $200. And of course, we can be quite irrational. People report feeling greater pain relief when the same drug is priced more expensively than when, for example, it is discounted. Just knowing a drug is more expensive than discounted makes you feel it's greater efficacy, irrational. And of course, we do know that reporting on menus, if you have a dollar sign or dollars after it, people think it is more expensive, an item is more expensive than just literally the number is there of the price. Irrational, but predictably so. Another fascinating thing about our irrationality is courtesy of Dan Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who you know as the authors of well, Daniel, the author of Thinking Fast and Slow, but both Nobel Prize winners. It's called availability bias, the tendency to think that whatever we hear about most recently or most frequently or is more common, popular, powerful, or more effective than it actually is. Now, this is a very serious concern today because a lot of us hang out only with folks we agree with, or we choose to read media only that we agree with the information we agree with. So, of course, what we see over and over again, we assume is true or trending or more right than it actually may really be. This is just not a problem with the common man. I've observed it in a lot of media folks, in that with all the buzz about social media and digital media, they assume it is, by nature, more effective than even something like TV. And even when looking at some of the reports from Nielsen about how effective TV still is, they choose not to believe it, even though there is evidence. Very interesting thing, availability bias. Now, of course, we, those of us in marketing, use availability bias quite often to our advantage. It is the purpose of frequency, ingraining in people's brains and their memory structures things like taglines or slogans. But that doesn't mean, of course, that what the tagline or slogan stands for is literally true. Take, for example, the tagline of Fox News, which is fair and balanced. Now, it's top of mind, but I challenge you to, any of you, to have evidence that say it is or it isn't. We just assume one way or the other based on our feelings. We jump to a conclusion based on little or no evidence. Now, that said, another characteristic of the brain, because remember it developed on the savannah and the limbic brain, is that even if we had reams of research about whether Fox News is fair or balanced, we probably would not be able to sort through the research and draw a very accurate conclusion, because the brain software is not built for complex comparisons, cannot handle a lot of difficult sorting through of information. A lot of famous studies talk about the degree to which too much choice or information shuts down the brain's ability to process information. And a lot of you probably know the jam jar experiment, where at a grocer, researchers put out 24 jars of jam for tasting and testing. And of course, flocks of people came to the table, but when it came time to choose to buy a jar, people were shut down. They could not choose between the 24. Then when the researchers put out 8 jars of jam, it didn't attract as many people, but they sold over 10 times more jam, because too much choice shuts down decision-making in our mere little brains. So again, something for us all to be mindful of. And it's really because the brain operates well on shortcuts. We evolved to have shortcuts for decision-making. Instead of weighing all the details, the brain relies on processing shortcuts like brands. If you know Marriott is a great brand, but you're looking for an inexpensive hotel, you might say, well, obviously I'm going to prefer Fairfield. When you need a shortcut and you want to buy something, you might buy the same brand as last time, or you have the same thing as your friend is having on the menu because you just don't want to sort through and choose through all the menu items. And of course, shortcuts are sort of all over our life. We shortcut impressions about a person based on their geographic origin, about their age, based on their age, on their gender. We today are famous for jumping to conclusions about a person, a shortcut, if we know how they stand on an issue or what political party they are a member of. And of course, these conclusions may have absolutely no basis in evidence. Just like people on TV are smarter and wealthier, we jump to these conclusions as how the brain works. Of course, we can sometimes use these to our advantage, as Apple famously did, branding someone with a characteristic and someone with a negative flip side of that characteristic, cool on the right and uncool on the left. Again, these shortcuts are essentially pattern recognition. And the brain evolved to be particularly pattern sensitive. It informs all of our decisions in great ways, as you'll see as we go on. In fact, evolution favored those identifying and storing as decision-making shortcuts what is most distinctive pattern-wise and most emotionally relevant. One of the pieces of advice we always get is to make one's brand distinctive. pattern-wise, and of course, emotionally relevant. The interesting thing about emotional relevance is this. Research shows that all human decision-making begins and ends with emotions. It's how the brain, frankly, is wired. One of the most fascinating bits of research being done today is by those folks who are studying folks who've had a brain injury that prevents them from perceiving or feeling emotion. And essentially, as this professor of neuroscience at USC says, these folks can't shop. Without emotion, you cannot make a decision. The interesting thing about emotion is it focuses attention. It helps trigger a shortcut. Is it relevant or not? Particularly emotional experiences embed themselves in the memory. Particularly heartfelt emotions trigger feel-good or terrifying chemicals in the brain. It imprints itself on the brain. So all great decision-making begins and ends with emotion, and we need to leverage that. As, in particular, one cultural anthropologist talks about the power of emotion, and again, without rationality. He says, "A brand is something that I am emotionally and instinctively attracted to if it helps me become more myself. It means no further explanation of attributes." Think about this. If you're a gorilla and you're walking along the mountain and you see a particular body type, emotionally and instinctively you are attracted to it because innately you know that that body type will be better able to bear you great children. There's a fascinating study about all of this kind of stuff in sexual attraction, love at first sight, what attracts people to each other without any further explanation of attributes. Fascinating, but it is how the brain works. And this means in particular that when you're looking for a compelling value proposition, the value proposition may have absolutely nothing to do with price or features or functionality. The most compelling value propositions are when you can show someone an emotional benefit that feeds their self-concept or who they aspire to be. That is the ultimate shortcut. And it is innate and instantaneous in us all, often in our subconscious. And when this happens, as the cultural anthropologist says, you are emotionally and instinctively attracted to it because subconsciously or maybe consciously, you know it helps you become more yourself or who you aspire to be. And the result is a sense of not just attraction, but price desensitization. You don't care what that thing costs, you want it. Now, this is a particularly important thing for all of us trying to influence behaviors because, again, if you can focus your brand around this, this is the center of your ecosystem in your omni-channel marketing, you really got a good thing going for you. In fact, some particularly great research done by an econometrician named Les Binet and a colleague of his called Peter Field, both from London. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Binet and Field. They're published a lot by the IPA. They've really studied this, and I'll spare you a lot of the data, but they especially note that evoking emotional relevance drives perceptions of value, desensitizes people to price, and as a result dramatically affects large business results. That's all you need to know from the small type here, but essentially what you see here is greater price elasticity when you argue with emotion only. Even raising rational items along with the emotional tends to stop people in the tracks to say, well, okay, those rational features and functions, I guess I should comparison shop other people's features and functionality. It sort of stops that shortcut immediate attraction. And in the same way, if you stress mostly the emotional as opposed to combine, you have greater business effects. And this is their summary metric for increased sales share margin and brand strength. They've summarized it into one metric. Very powerful stuff. Now, the interesting thing about their research as well says it really takes 3 years to maximize all of this. I'll come and get to that later. I jumped ahead. The point is, if you're an investor and you really look at who to invest in, you look for desensitization of price, the ability to drive price elasticity. As Warren Buffett says, the single most important decision in evaluating a business is its pricing power. If you've got the power to raise prices without losing business to competitors, you have a very good business because, of course, you can price more, you can grow your margin. There's math to go with this. McKinsey says that if you increase unit volume 1%, you get an over 3% increase in operating profit. But if you can increase price 1%, you will get an 11% increase in operating profit. So when you think about the old push strategies we used to use to drive volume, that's really, an unproductive model. The pull price of desensitizing people with emotion, so you can increase price 1%, is mathematically, without question, the way to go. To give you an example of the power of this, I want to show you a little case from my own firm where essentially we identified an emotional benefit that was so powerful it crashed the client's e-business site on Black Friday. We were thrilled because it said things were so effective. The client was not amused. But essentially, this was for a company that makes massagers of the hand, the back, full body massagers. You sit on a couch and sit against. They were absolutely certain that the positioning for this should be to those of us who work on computers all day, desk jockeys who want to come home and massage our computer muscles and have a glass of wine or a craft beer and just feel better and have a spa-like experience at home. But the work of our account planners, mainly Rick Stone, who's with me today, did some interesting psychological and psychoanalysis of the target and found a couple of wonderful things. First of all, an insight that was far more resonant with people than go home and have a spa-like experience. But it was such a universal, timeless emotional benefit that it broadened the target to pretty much everyone. And I challenge you to watch the video explaining that emotional benefit and see if you don't see yourself in the video. And again, this is a rhythmatic we showed to the C-suite of the client to introduce the positioning concept. Does not consider ourselves a gladiator of the daily grind? Who among us does not have to say, I gotta do it, get up and do it again tomorrow? Such a universal emotional benefit, help doing it again tomorrow. Oh my God. The interesting thing about a really broad-based, timeless, universal emotional benefit is it's an amazing platform, not just for communications, but for innovations. I could challenge all of you now to come up with a new product or service or a line extension or a vertical extension for homedics, and all it has to do is help you do it again tomorrow. It could be a mattress. It could be a vitamin. The point is, a timeless emotional benefit is a platform for innovations that you can offer today, tomorrow, 5 years from now, and build the brand along with it in a timeless and universal way. But specific to communications, now for the fire raging in my shoulders, Homedics, #1 in brand massage, official sponsor of Doing It Again Tomorrow. No features or functionality in there. First shift, director of logistics, second shift, mom. Official sponsor of Doing It Again Tomorrow. It's not just your phone that needs recharging. Official sponsor of Doing It Again Tomorrow. Now again, back to Les and Peter's research. Their research again shows that campaigns that evoke strong emotional benefits yielded the biggest long-term profits, again, desensitizing to people to price. But you'll see on this bit of information, it really maximizes it over 3 years. And this is a very important factor for us in educating those folks we report to, especially the C-suite and the board, because oftentimes people might not see the spike in their results in 3 months or 6 months, and they want to change the campaign or they want to change the CMO. Building those memory structures of the emotional benefit that feeds people's self-concept, and then activating them with rational incentives. I could say to all of you right now, a great rational incentive, I have a beautiful car sitting out on the curb at 32 Old Slip, and I'm going to give it to you for only $500 for the first person who raises their hand. But you're going to want to say, well, what brand of car is it? You want to interpolate an emotional benefit. Just telling people that you've got a deal for them is not going to be very meaningful because they can't place an emotional value on it. They don't know the emotional relevance. But if in fact we all like the idea of happiness, as Coke for so long has stood for, standing on a hill in Italy and singing about let's live in harmony, oh my God, talk about a timeless emotional benefit. If happiness is on sale this Friday, certainly we'll want to buy more of it. It really is the combo that works. Now, again, this is all about building those long-term memory structures that take as much as 3 years of sticking with that message. Activation, of course, can spike sales but decays quickly, so it can actually be quite cost inefficient. It's actually embedding in memory that emotional value and the iconography that triggers that memory. It takes time, it takes frequency. This is sort of marketing 101 that, of course, was famous in the 80s and 90s and the year 2000, and somehow around 2008, a lot of the folks that were experienced in this got laid off or left, and people were desperate to just get cash coming in the door, so activation sort of took over the last 10 years. It's a shame. But so much did it take over. A couple of years ago, we surveyed thousands of folks in marketing around the world about the percentage of their budget they spent on activation versus brand building. And over 88% reported that all of their budget was spent on activation, when in fact the work of Bennett and Field show that activation ROI peaks at about 40% as a share of your budget. So a lot of folks were spending over 40% and getting nothing for it, wasting that money when they could have been spending it on brand building. Now, Les and Peter continue to spend a lot of time researching this. They have an approximate ratio of the spend, 60% on brand building, building that emotional benefit, 40% on short-term activation. This varies a bit by category, or of course, the legacy of the brand, the degree to which a brand is already embedded in people's long-term memory. But it's a good rule of thumb and certainly a lot better than spending 88 or 100% of your budget on activation. So keep that in mind. And again, emphasis on embedding in people's long-term memory structures that emotional benefit and also the iconography that triggers it. Embedding patterns and shortcuts into memory is our business. And it works because of how the brain evolved. We cannot take anything away from that. If some of you know the firm called Brain Juicer, now called System 1, they also just added to the body of knowledge around this. It's not just logos that are important patterns that drive return. It is, of course, what they call conceits, a great British word for characters like Sanders or the gecko. Those conceits as well build long-term memory structures and are very important. If you study Byron Sharp and the work of the Ehrenberg Bass Institute of Marketing Science and how brands grow, there are two things that really drive growth. One is embedding memory structures in the brain like these. The other is market penetration, getting as many customers as possible, even occasional users, because the greater number of customers has a mathematical impact on overhead, so more money falls to the bottom line. And in addition, loyalty is really not all it's cracked up to be. If I shampoo once a day, you aren't going to get me to shampoo twice a day. You can only take loyalty so far in trying to get people, loyal customers, to buy more. That's sort of an aside. I want to stress here embedding patterns and shortcuts because, of course, stories are a form of shortcut that, if done well, embed themselves into people's memories. They are essentially patterns. And if you study Carl Jung and a lot of other famous psychologists and psychiatrists, there is a universal unconscious, and we all have the same story of the hero's journey, which probably a lot of you know. The typical archetypes, and you're going to hear a little bit more about archetypes later today, are all part of embedded structures, in a sense, stereotypes. The same story narrative is with all of us, and again we go back to Kahneman, who says the brain is hardwired for stories, because those of us who've survived because we benefited from the stories our tribe told about who the enemy was, what the socially acceptable behavior was in the tribe, so we could survive. Again, a neuroscientist at USC. A story told in such a way that a person can imagine themselves actually in it is a very persuasive thing. It creates a memory structure as if it actually happened. I think our whole profession is right to be telling stories, but I think the thing we miss is telling a story in such a way that the person we want to attract, the God we want to attract, sees themselves actually in it. Now again, bringing this all together, knowing it takes 3 years to embed iconography and benefits and emotions in people's memory structure, it essentially means that efficient and profitable growth comes from broadly seeding mental structures and fame with people 3 years before they're in the market for a product or service. The cigarette companies got into trouble for this a long time ago. They were perceived to be advertising to youth. Car companies today and beer companies just coincidentally do have their ads seen by young people. But it's something we all have to remember in an activation-happy world. You can't just go out there and do something one day and expect to be building a brand. It takes years. And ideally, you'll start 3 years before someone is in the market for your product or service. And note that word there, fame. Broadly seeding mental structures and fame. The research of Les and Peter again says that fame is driven by broad reach. Again, that's that attempt to get market penetration. The broader the reach, the broader and the bigger the effects. And again, the font has merged here, but we target existing. If you target existing customers versus just new customers versus on the far right, target the whole market, you will, of course, grow more, have more fame, and again, be building those memory structures in more people, so again, grow and share. Fame is driven by original ideas. This was a big study done by Les and Peter, and essentially, original messages are more engaging because they deviate from the expected pattern. So of course, they get more notice, more buzz, which means you get more from your money, which is media efficiency. And they used as this the database of the IPA, thousands and thousands of cases across categories and across the world. Now, fame is 50% more likely to lead to large business effects because it drives perceptions of value. Again, their business effects increases in sales share margin and brand strength. Interestingly enough, to that earlier point about how the human mind jumps to crazy conclusions based on one characteristic. If you think a brand is famous, if you think a person has appeared on TV versus mere newspaper or radio, you will attribute to them all kinds of other characteristics, including greater quality. If you think something is famous, you will assume it is better. Interestingly enough, a brand ranked as the most popular, even if it's not, will become the most popular. An interesting thing that Amazon knows very well. Now, I get asked a lot by folks, this is all great, MARSHA, but what about digital, social, mobile media? How do we influence people under those conditions? And often they are surprised when I tell them that, the brain that walks down the grocery store or sits in front of the TV is the same brain with the same processing mechanisms used when we're looking at social media content or getting something on our phone. The same principles work because it's how the brain processes information regardless of the technology. So, an important thing to remember is the reason solar power and wind power is very effective and very efficient is because of what happens naturally. And I encourage you to go forth to try and influence people's behaviors by using what works is because you aren't going against the tide. You aren't trying to make something happen against what is the natural flow of people's brains. Now, perhaps you came to the session today to be changed by some of the presentations. I certainly came here to change and influence you. And hopefully you will go forth now better equipped to influence and change the behaviors of others. Thank you.